What if I told you that a $200 billion mega infrastructure dream is being linked to Zimbabwe, a project so massive, so ambitious, that it's being described as a nation-transforming masterpiece? A vision of towering concrete walls, endless reservoirs, futuristic power grids, and a reimagined economic future. This is the bold narrative surrounding Maxwell Chikumbutso, and today, we're diving deep into what this dream really represents. In recent years, Chikumbutso has become one of the most talked-about inventors in Africa. From energy machines to futuristic transportation concepts, his announcements consistently spark headlines and heated debates. But this time, the scale is different. We're not talking about a single device or a prototype vehicle. We're talking about infrastructure on a continental scale. The idea centers on a mega dam project reportedly valued at $200 billion, a number that immediately captures global attention. For context, that kind of investment rivals some of the largest infrastructure undertakings in modern history. It places the proposal in the same financial universe as China's mega dam expansions or multi-decade Gulf development programs. The ambition alone is staggering. Zimbabwe already hosts one of Africa's most iconic water engineering feats, the Kariba Dam, a structure that has powered economies and shaped regional energy supply for decades. Now imagine something positioned as even more transformative, not just an energy source, but a full-scale economic catalyst designed to redefine Zimbabwe's industrial future. According to discussions surrounding the vision, this mega infrastructure dream is not merely about electricity generation. It is described as an integrated development ecosystem. Hydropower at its core. Industrial parks connected directly to the grid. Smart water management systems controlling agricultural expansion. Urban zones built around sustainable energy hubs. Transport corridors engineered to support heavy industry and exports. The proposal frames water not as a passive resource, but as a strategic economic engine. Picture the scene: a colossal dam wall stretching across a major river basin, turbines roaring beneath the surface, high-voltage transmission lines radiating outward like arteries, feeding a living organism. Surrounding it, newly constructed highways, cargo rail systems, manufacturing plants, and technology parks. A carefully orchestrated attempt to shift Zimbabwe from resource dependence to industrial dominance. But a $200 billion valuation raises serious questions. To understand the magnitude, consider that Zimbabwe's annual GDP is a fraction of that figure. Funding such a project would require international investors, sovereign partnerships, development banks, and likely decades of phased construction. It would demand environmental impact assessments, regional water-sharing negotiations, and unprecedented financial coordination. Large-scale dams have always carried both promise and controversy. They generate renewable energy and stabilize power grids. They can also displace communities, alter ecosystems, and reshape river systems permanently. Around the world, mega dams have triggered both economic booms and environmental debates. Supporters argue that Africa needs bold infrastructure leaps, not incremental steps. They say transformative growth requires visionary risk-taking. They believe the continent's industrialization depends on energy independence, and that mega projects create ripple effects across employment, education, and innovation. Critics, however, urge caution. They question feasibility. They demand transparency. They ask whether projected technologies and financial structures have been independently verified. In an era of global economic volatility, they emphasize the importance of rigorous scrutiny before celebrating monumental claims. Yet regardless of skepticism or support, one thing is undeniable: the narrative itself is powerful. Infrastructure is psychological as much as physical. When a nation imagines something monumental, it reshapes its identity. Mega bridges, towering dams, futuristic cities. These symbols signal ambition. They create momentum. They inspire youth to think beyond limitation. And that may be the most significant impact of all. Because even before concrete is poured or turbines spin, the conversation shifts. Investors begin asking questions. Engineers analyze possibilities. Media outlets debate outcomes. Citizens imagine new futures. Whether fully realized or partially implemented, the concept injects a sense of scale into national dialogue. Now, let's break down the potential structural components that would make such a project technically plausible. First, hydrological viability. A dam of this magnitude requires consistent river flow, geological stability, and reservoir capacity capable of supporting multi-gigawatt output. Second, turbine technology. Modern hydro systems use high-efficiency Francis or Kaplan turbines optimized for specific flow conditions. Third, grid integration. Without a robust transmission network, generation capacity becomes meaningless. Fourth, industrial absorption. Electricity must power something. Factories, refineries, data centers, transport electrification networks. Then comes financing architecture. Mega projects often rely on layered funding, public-private partnerships, long-term bonds, development bank financing, export credit agreements, and foreign direct investment. Risk mitigation instruments become crucial. Currency stabilization strategies must be addressed. Long-term revenue modeling must be credible enough to attract institutional investors. Every layer multiplies complexity. And yet, complexity is not impossibility. History shows that transformative infrastructure often began as audacious proposals. The Hoover Dam, the Three Gorges Dam, entire desert cities constructed from blueprint to skyline within decades. What separates vision from fantasy is execution, transparency, and sustained political will. If implemented responsibly, a mega dam in Zimbabwe could stabilize energy shortages, reduce import dependency, and position the nation as a regional power exporter. It could stimulate heavy manufacturing, modernize irrigation, and catalyze job creation on a massive scale. But if poorly structured, it could strain public finances, spark ecological concerns, and undermine economic stability. This is why the global reaction has been so intense. Because at $200 billion, the stakes are not symbolic. They are generational. And perhaps that's the deeper story here, not just about one inventor or one announcement, but about Africa's hunger for scale. For decades, development conversations around the continent have been framed in cautious increments. Now, narratives are shifting toward mega ambition, toward leapfrogging stages of growth, rather than slowly climbing them. As discussions continue, analysts watch for feasibility studies. Investors wait for concrete financial disclosures. Engineers debate structural viability. Environmental experts assess potential downstream impact. Citizens wonder what transformation would truly look like in their daily lives: stable electricity, expanding industries, rising employment, improved infrastructure networks. The silence between announcement and implementation becomes a space filled with anticipation. Because if even a fraction of this $200 billion vision materializes, Zimbabwe's economic trajectory could pivot in ways few predicted. Energy corridors could link neighboring nations. Export routes could strengthen regional trade. Industrial ecosystems could anchor new technology clusters. And in that possibility lies the tension, the space between dream and reality, between headline and blueprint, between ambition and execution. But what makes this story even more intriguing is how it fits into the broader pattern of bold technological declarations associated with Maxwell Chikumbutso. Each announcement builds a narrative of revolutionary potential. Each claim attracts both admiration and scrutiny. And with every new proposal, the scale expands. So the question evolves. Is this the dawn of a new African mega-infrastructure era? Is Zimbabwe positioning itself for an unprecedented industrial pivot? Or is this a visionary concept waiting for the structural proof that will convert skeptics into believers? Because in infrastructure, belief is capital, and capital follows confidence. As engineers begin hypothetical modeling and financial analysts simulate revenue curves, another layer emerges: geopolitical influence. A mega dam doesn't exist in isolation. It reshapes regional water agreements. It affects downstream nations. It invites global partnerships. It alters trade balances. Which means this $200 billion dream is not merely concrete and steel. It is diplomacy, economics, environment, technology, and psychology intertwined. And as more details surface, feasibility frameworks, strategic partners, construction timelines, regulatory approvals. The world will be watching closely, waiting to see whether Zimbabwe's mega-infrastructure dream transitions from announcement to excavation, from blueprint to foundation, from vision to physical reality. Because the moment ground breaks, everything changes. Surveyors would mark the terrain. Geologists would drill deep core samples into the earth, testing rock density and fault stability. Environmental teams would map biodiversity corridors and downstream ecosystems. Financial committees would finalize phased capital deployment strategies. What begins as a headline would transform into measurable action. Contracts signed, machinery mobilized, supply chains activated. Imagine the early construction phase. Colossal excavators carving into riverbanks, temporary diversion tunnels rerouting water flow, concrete batching plants operating around the clock. Thousands of engineers, welders, crane operators, and technicians forming a temporary industrial city around the build site. Housing compounds rising for workers. Logistics hubs moving steel, turbines, transformers, and reinforced materials from ports to inland routes. At this scale, the dam would not simply be a structure. It would be an ecosystem under construction. Phase 1 would likely prioritize structural stabilization, cofferdams installed to create dry working conditions. Then foundation pouring begins. Millions of cubic meters of concrete layered with surgical precision. Every segment tested for stress tolerance. Sensors embedded within the structure to monitor long-term integrity. Modern mega dams rely heavily on data infrastructure. They are as much digital networks as physical barriers. Then comes the powerhouse. If projections suggest multi-gigawatt capacity, turbine chambers would be carved beneath the main wall. High-efficiency generators aligned with water intake tunnels. Control rooms built with advanced grid management systems capable of balancing national load demand in real time. Integration with smart grid software would allow predictive distribution, redirecting energy during peak industrial hours and stabilizing residential consumption at night. And that's where the broader economic web begins tightening. With consistent high-output electricity, energy-intensive industries become viable. Steel manufacturing, aluminum smelting, large-scale data centers, fertilizer plants for agricultural expansion, electric rail systems, battery assembly facilities. Each of these industries feeds into others, compounding economic momentum. Industrial clusters often form around reliable power. That's how regional transformation accelerates. But scale introduces complexity. Water allocation agreements must be negotiated with downstream regions. Seasonal rainfall variability must be accounted for. Climate modeling becomes essential, long-term hydrological forecasts spanning decades. Drought-resilient strategies would need to be built into reservoir management. Spillway capacity must anticipate extreme flood events amplified by climate change patterns. Every megadam in history has faced this balancing act. Maximize output while safeguarding ecosystems and communities. Relocation plans, if required, would need transparency and fairness. Compensation frameworks must be clear. Infrastructure upgrades, roads, schools, hospitals, would need to accompany any community displacement. The social contract around a project of this magnitude can determine whether it becomes a unifying symbol or a point of contention. Meanwhile, international observers would evaluate debt sustainability ratios. A $200 billion project cannot rely solely on domestic funding. It implies consortium financing, possibly involving sovereign wealth funds, multinational engineering firms, development banks, and export credit agencies. Each investor demands accountability. Milestone-based disbursement. Independent auditing. Risk mitigation instruments. Insurance coverage for political and environmental contingencies. And in the midst of all this, the narrative around Maxwell Chikumbutso would intensify. Supporters would frame him as a visionary catalyzing national ambition. Critics would demand empirical validation at every stage. Analysts would compare the scale to landmark global projects, debating whether Zimbabwe's economic fundamentals align with such an undertaking. But here's where it becomes strategically fascinating. Even partial implementation, say a scaled phase valued at a fraction of $200 billion, could still be transformative. A 10-gigawatt hydropower plant alone would dramatically shift national energy dynamics. Energy exports to neighboring states could create foreign currency inflows. Regional grid interconnections could strengthen southern African energy markets. Infrastructure of this size creates leverage. It influences trade negotiations. It enhances geopolitical standing. It reshapes investment perception. Countries once viewed through a lens of limitation begin to be seen as arenas of possibility. Yet, caution remains essential. Mega dams globally have sometimes exceeded budgets by billions. Timelines stretch beyond projections. Environmental litigation can halt construction. Currency fluctuations can distort repayment schedules. The difference between strategic triumph and fiscal strain often lies in governance discipline. Which brings us back to the central tension of this unfolding story. Is this an audacious but achievable roadmap? Or is it an aspirational blueprint awaiting structural proof? Because the world has seen both outcomes before. What makes Zimbabwe's situation unique is its developmental inflection point. Reliable energy could unlock manufacturing corridors. Modern irrigation could reduce food imports. Infrastructure corridors could anchor new urban expansion zones. Youth employment could surge through engineering and technical skill development programs tied directly to the project. Picture universities aligning curricula with hydro-engineering, grid optimization, environmental science, and project management. A generation trained specifically to maintain and expand large-scale infrastructure. Knowledge transfer embedded within construction contracts. Local firms subcontracted to ensure domestic participation in economic value chains. That's how mega infrastructure multiplies beyond its physical form. It seeds capability. And if capability takes root, the dam becomes more than concrete and turbines. It becomes institutional muscle, the ability to execute future mega projects with increasing precision. As anticipation builds, feasibility studies would become the critical next milestone. Geological surveys, hydrological simulations, financial stress tests, environmental impact assessments, these documents would determine whether the dream advances into procurement stages. Global engineering giants might enter preliminary bidding rounds. Joint ventures could form. Strategic memorandums of understanding signed. And with every document released, skepticism would either intensify or soften depending on transparency and detail. Markets respond to clarity. Citizens respond to progress. The psychological momentum of construction cranes rising against the skyline can reshape national confidence. For emerging economies, visible infrastructure often signals forward motion more powerfully than policy speeches. But at $200 billion, execution discipline must be relentless. Cost overruns could spiral without strict oversight. Corruption safeguards must be airtight. Procurement frameworks must withstand international scrutiny. Public communication must remain consistent and factual to prevent misinformation cycles. And yet, amid all this caution, ambition still pulses at the center. Because nations that never attempt scale rarely achieve scale. Whether this mega infrastructure dream unfolds exactly as envisioned or evolves into a restructured, phased initiative, the conversation itself marks a shift. It signals a willingness to imagine Zimbabwe not as a peripheral player, but as a central energy and industrial hub in southern Africa. And as feasibility reviews continue, as investors weigh opportunity against risk, as engineers calculate load factors and structural tolerances, one thing remains certain. The space between dream and reality is narrowing, measured not in headlines now, but in data, negotiations, and technical validation. Quietly being decided behind conference tables, in engineering labs, and within the corridors of financial institutions that specialize in projects too large for ordinary imagination. Because once a proposal crosses a certain threshold of seriousness, it begins to move differently. Feasibility conversations turn into technical drafts. Technical drafts evolve into preliminary designs. Preliminary designs attract conditional interest. And conditional interest becomes leverage that can either elevate a nation's trajectory or test its structural resilience. If momentum continues, the next phase would involve international engineering assessments. Independent verification teams analyzing projected megawatt capacity. Hydrologists modeling 50-year and even 100-year rainfall patterns. Seismic experts simulating stress under extreme geological events. Advanced software would replicate worst-case flood scenarios, measuring spillway adequacy down to the centimeter. Mega dams are not built on optimism. They are built on calculations so precise that a margin of error can redefine outcomes for generations. Meanwhile, the financial architecture would undergo stress testing. Revenue projections would be measured against energy demand curves. Industrial absorption rates would be modeled based on projected manufacturing growth. Export agreements would be drafted tentatively with neighboring countries, contingent on delivery timelines. Energy buyers don't commit to ambition, they commit to reliability. If Zimbabwe were to position itself as a regional exporter of power, cross-border transmission agreements would need to be negotiated carefully. Grid synchronization standards aligned. Pricing mechanisms structured to remain competitive against other regional suppliers. Currency risk hedging instruments layered into contracts to protect long-term revenue flows. And beneath all of this, domestic perception would continue to evolve. For citizens, the concept of a $200 billion project feels almost abstract, a number so large it transcends everyday comprehension. But as site fencing appears, as heavy equipment arrives, as recruitment notices circulate, abstraction becomes tangible. Local economies near the project site would begin shifting immediately. Housing demand would rise. Service industries would expand. Transportation routes would be upgraded. Mega infrastructure often creates microbooms before the first turbine ever spins. Yet sustainability remains the defining variable. Modern infrastructure cannot ignore environmental stewardship. Reservoir ecosystems would require biodiversity management plans. Fish migration corridors might need engineered bypass systems. Sediment flow would have to be monitored to prevent long-term capacity reduction. Reforestation programs could be implemented around catchment areas to stabilize rainfall cycles. Climate resilience would be non-negotiable. Hydropower is renewable, but it is also vulnerable to prolonged drought cycles. Therefore, integration with complementary energy systems could become part of the broader strategy. Solar farms feeding into the same transmission grid. Wind corridors mapped for diversification. Battery storage systems deployed to smooth load variability. The mega dam would not exist as a standalone monument. It would anchor an energy ecosystem. And here is where the strategic narrative deepens. Large-scale infrastructure alters national psychology. It reframes what is considered possible. When a country undertakes something of extraordinary scale, it signals internally and externally that it is willing to operate beyond conventional boundaries. For Maxwell Chikumbutso, this project represents more than engineering. It reinforces a broader pattern of high-magnitude vision. Each announcement expands the perimeter of ambition. Each proposal tests the boundary between skepticism and belief. But belief alone cannot sustain concrete. Governance mechanisms would determine longevity. Transparent reporting cycles. Independent audit committees. Public disclosure frameworks. Procurement oversight bodies insulated from political volatility. Without these pillars, even the most ambitious blueprint can fracture under pressure. And pressure is inevitable. International markets fluctuate. Commodity prices shift. Political cycles change leadership priorities. Currency valuations swing unpredictably. A project spanning multiple years, potentially decades, must survive variables far beyond initial enthusiasm. That's why phased implementation would likely be critical. Instead of deploying $200 billion in a single surge, structured rollout could occur in strategic segments. Phase 1. Foundational hydropower core. Phase 2. Transmission grid modernization. Phase 3. Industrial park development. Phase 4. Export corridor expansion. Each phase generating incremental returns to finance the next. If executed with discipline, such structuring reduces systemic shock. It allows course correction. It builds confidence gradually rather than demanding immediate global trust. And yet, time remains a defining factor. Mega projects require patience measured not in news cycles, but in years. Public attention may surge during announcement and groundbreaking ceremonies, then fade during prolonged construction periods. Maintaining momentum demands consistent communication, tangible milestones that demonstrate measurable progress. Milestones create credibility. Concrete poured. Turbine installed. Grid connected. First megawatt generated. First export transmitted. Each step reinforcing the narrative that the dream is transitioning into operational reality. But beyond economics and engineering lies something even more profound. Water infrastructure historically reshapes civilizations. From ancient irrigation empires to modern hydroelectric superstructures, control over water has equated to stability and influence. If Zimbabwe were to harness its river systems at unprecedented scale, it would reposition itself strategically within Southern Africa's development architecture. Energy independence reduces vulnerability. Export capacity increases negotiation leverage. Industrial ecosystems generate compounding wealth. Youth employment reduces migration pressure. Infrastructure confidence attracts parallel investment in sectors like technology, manufacturing, and advanced agriculture. The ripple effects multiply. However, if feasibility studies reveal structural or financial fragility, recalibration becomes essential. Scaling down capacity, adjusting timelines, diversifying funding sources. Strategic retreat is not failure. It is responsible engineering. And this is where the world's attention sharpens. Because transformative infrastructure is never just about machinery. It is about discipline, about transparency, about whether vision aligns with execution capability. As consultants refine blueprints and investors examine spreadsheets, the distance between aspiration and implementation narrows further. Discussions once hypothetical begin to solidify into decision points. Approve or delay. Scale up or restructure. Commit fully or recalibrate cautiously. Every decision writes the next chapter. And as negotiations continue behind closed doors, as simulations run through thousands of stress scenarios, as environmental boards draft conditional approvals, Zimbabwe's mega infrastructure dream exists in a powerful transitional state, not merely an idea, not yet a completed monument, but something suspended in possibility. Possibility carries tension. It carries hope for economic acceleration. It carries risk of overextension. It carries the weight of expectation from citizens and observers alike. And perhaps the most defining factor will not be the size of the dam wall or the capacity of its turbines, but the precision of the systems that support it, financial integrity, environmental foresight, governance stability, and technological adaptability. Because in the modern era, mega infrastructure is less about concrete dominance and more about systemic intelligence. Smart grids, predictive maintenance sensors, real-time hydrological data analytics, AI-assisted load balancing, digital twins simulating structural stress years before it manifests physically. If integrated effectively, the dam could become a living system, continuously optimizing performance, forecasting challenges, and adapting to environmental variability. And if that happens, Zimbabwe's narrative shifts permanently. Not as a country chasing development, but as one engineering it deliberately. For now, the world waits in observation mode. Engineers analyze quietly. Investors calculate silently. Citizens speculate passionately. And somewhere within that convergence of calculation and conviction, the true trajectory of this $200 billion dream continues unfolding, not in dramatic headlines, but in the incremental, disciplined decisions that determine whether ambition hardens into infrastructure. Because at this level, momentum is fragile. A single signed agreement can accelerate timelines by years. A single unresolved dispute can freeze progress indefinitely. That is the razor's edge where mega infrastructure lives, suspended between breakthrough and delay. If negotiations solidify, the procurement stage would ignite a new wave of activity. International construction consortiums assembling specialized teams. Hydropower engineers collaborating with structural analysts. Environmental planners integrating mitigation systems directly into early-stage designs rather than retrofitting them later. Insurance underwriters calculating exposure across decades of operational lifespan. Risk mapping would become a science of its own. political risk, currency risk, climate risk, engineering risk, supply chain risk. Every scenario would be stress-tested. Models would simulate extreme drought cycles, unexpected sediment buildup, turbine maintenance intervals, regional energy demand shifts, even global commodity fluctuations that could affect construction materials like steel and copper. Mega infrastructure is not built for today. It is engineered for decades of uncertainty. And while technical teams refine projections, public anticipation would continue to build. Media outlets would amplify updates. Analysts would debate milestones. Supporters would highlight potential job creation figures, thousands during construction, hundreds permanently in operations and maintenance. Technical training programs might emerge, preparing local engineers and technicians to assume long-term oversight. Skill transfer would be critical. If international firms dominate construction but fail to embed local expertise, the long-term sustainability weakens. But if contracts mandate apprenticeship programs, university partnerships, and domestic subcontracting quotas, the project could seed an entirely new generation of infrastructure specialists within Zimbabwe. That generational shift might ultimately prove more valuable than the electricity itself, because knowledge compounds. And as institutional competence grows, future projects, rail expansions, advanced manufacturing hubs, smart cities become easier to execute. One mega project can recalibrate national confidence in delivering complex systems. Yet the energy equation remains central. Hydropower at scale could stabilize national grids that have historically faced shortages. Consistent supply reduces blackouts. Reduced blackouts increase industrial productivity. Increased productivity attracts foreign direct investment. Investment expands employment. Employment strengthens domestic purchasing power. Purchasing power stimulates service sectors.